Greetings, friends! In our continued coverage of the Avengers series, we are now looking at an early 90s, but short run, by Fabian Nicieza. We'll talk about how this era of comics initially suffered a lot of problems before eventually finding a direction never before seen in Avengers history. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more comic book news, reviews, and more. Fabian Nicieza joined the Avengers series in one of the most difficult situations a writer could ask for. As stated in our previous round, his predecessor John Byrne had essentially thrown a fit and left the series in the middle of a story arc. And it was up to Nicieza to pick over the pieces of this underdeveloped story. The end result is an overly long tale of the Avengers in space with Spider-Man, which Nicieza was unable to improve meaningfully. One can hardly blame the guy. I don't know of any writer who could take somebody else's already bad story halfway in production and magically turn it into a good story. That would be a very difficult challenge for anybody, even a cool writer who co-created Deadpool and over the years created a number of successful X-Men titles. However, I am generally grading the comics themselves rather than the intent of the writers or specific details surrounding what went wrong in the production of these books. At the end of the day, these grades largely reflect the comics themselves, not the drama behind the scenes. That drama does inform a lot of what was going on with the Avengers around this time, and it's worth talking about for that reason. It explains, for example, how a talented writer like Nicieza, who still remains as such all the way here in 2020, is actually writing this Juggernaut series that's ongoing right now, and we have this cool poster for in the background here. Well, a talented writer like that can still not get the strongest grade in the world if he's handed an impossible assignment. One way or another, that Avengers story arc didn't work out, and is one of the worst arcs I've ever read. As the first Avengers comics ever written by Fabian Nicieza, it's a just plain awful start. Beyond just being a dry and drab storyline overall, I don't know what it is exactly, but too often when Spider-Man shows up in the Avengers, he's impossibly annoying and obnoxious, and it's really at play in this particular arc. This very much affected my final grade for this particular time in the Avengers series, but it should be clear right from the beginning that this grade doesn't say as much about Fabian Nicieza as a writer as it should, because there are other factors at play here. There's the artwork, the editing, the culture at the time, the history of the series, the history of comics in general. These are all relevant things to consider when reviewing comics. So I understand why and how Nicieza starts out writing for the Avengers, and it's just terrible. He had no control at first over the characters, no say over the art already produced for this story, and no ability to alter things quick enough to make up for all the problems created by John Byrne. The series had suddenly been derailed, and derailed hard, with Nicieza and the larger team at Marvel forced to pick up whatever was left over. What followed basically saved this era of Avengers. Fabian wrote another 6-part Avengers story called The Crossing Line, while writer Michael Higgins wrote an annual featuring John Byrne's team going on a pretty fun adventure with some Atlantean hijinks. And this era would close out with Mark Gruenwald writing a comic himself. It's a very transitionary period with a lot of different writers and artists involved, and based on how I've been doing things, largely skipping over guest spots and only really focusing on major shifts within the ongoing series, the Fabian Nicieza era, if you can call it that, barely hits the threshold of me reviewing and counting it. But while it's very clear Nicieza, Higgins, and Gruenwald were all sort of filling in on the writing side of things while a more permanent fixture for the series could be found, which they basically had to do at last minute thanks to John Byrne, it is worth looking at this era as part of a changing series and an important moment in Avengers history. It's kind of a shame though, because what was supposed to just be a filler arc produced over the year 1990 turns out to not only be important and relevant to present-day Avengers, we'll talk more about that when we get to it, but also a fun vision for what the team could be in this new decade. Paired with artists like Paul Ryan, Tom Palmer, Renee Ritterstatter, Max Scheele, and more, Fabian's story The Crossing Line, which runs from issues 319 to 325, gives us a version of the Avengers quite new from what we've seen before. Largely working with John Byrne's team as a starting point, Nicieza added aquatic-themed superhero Stingray, who I found pretty fun, and focused on a complex story, again with the Atlanteans, but this time in a conflict that also pulled in the likes of the People's Proectorate, a Russian-based superhero team clearly set up to rival the Avengers, and Alpha Flight, the Canadian-based superhero team. What I liked about this story is, in spite of its obligatory superhero standoffs and understandable political tensions between the three nations, the arc of the story really trends towards these representatives of these countries coming together to solve a problem at hand. In spite of it being a very classic Avengers-y story, there's a warmth and optimism I think really fits with the political climate of the time. In the uncertainty of the Soviet Union coming down, with the 90s being a very different world compared to what had come before it, the crossing line feels like it sort of reflects an optimism and hope for a potentially more peaceful future, and it fits nicely with Avengers history. There's a certain vision here being presented of the Avengers being part of a larger international community of superhero teams around the world that fits with that political narrative. And those teams all have their own dynamics and political motivations, yet at the end of the day they all want to protect their people along with the world around them. I like this dynamic going on within this story, while the artwork feels increasingly dynamic and fun. We get a great blend of more modern sensibilities with the classic established look of Avengers comics, evoking a transition in the team. Nicieza very much shaped the modern era of comics, though certainly not alone. And though his time with the Avengers was a relatively small part of his career, you could very much see his usual instincts and style for more grounded stories with down-to-earth, action-heavy characters being operated on in these few Avengers comics that he did write. As for the books by Higgins and Gruenwald written around this time, they too are of a similar tone. In all these stories, there are more serious ideas at play with the Avengers at this time, but things are still quite loose, fun, and cheerful. It's the type of balance that works well for this sort of team, and in spite of all the drama he caused behind the scenes, I do have to say Mark Gruenwald isn't a terrible Avengers writer. Based on what I read out of this book, one could argue some of the particulars and conflict he created as an editor for this series wasn't exactly arbitrary, and he might have had a decent direction for the Avengers on the whole in mind when he was pushing for it. I still think Roger Stern and Walt Simonson had better ideas for the team than Gruenwald, but regardless of the interpretation, I think it's worth stating I enjoyed Mark Gruenwald's Avengers comic. For the third era in a row, we are once again awarding a series of Avengers comics a B grade of some form. A B- does indicate it is above average, but having been unable to salvage John Byrne's final story arc, and having it affect Fabian's run so heavily, basically with him just doing that and a single other story arc, this time with the team is very limited, and as such, so is its value. I really like the version of what the team could have been in the 90s as presented in Fabian's larger story, and even the comics written by Higgins and Gruenwald. Tom Palmer and Paul Ryan remain excellent Avengers artists that truly give life and energy to Nicieza's big story arc. If it weren't for the disaster of John Byrne's exit, this era of Avengers would probably have been left with a stronger grade, of course. And I do want to make it clear that I put that blame largely on John Byrne as opposed to Fabian Nicieza, based on everything we know about these people now. Byrne might have gotten a higher grade for the Avengers comics he actually wrote, but he did inflict tremendous harm on the series in a way that damaged not only himself but others as well, and I think that's worth remembering and making a very clear note of here. Still, I shouldn't come down too hard on John Byrne in spite of everything we know about the man. We weren't there in the offices of Marvel during the production of these books. I was like 0 years old, and can never really know for sure what happened exactly. But we do know what happened next. Somebody over at Marvel, perhaps Gruenwald himself, had a great idea, and had a legend in the world of comic books who had risen up through the ranks writing G.I. Joe comics in the 1980s take a crack at the Avengers. Just 2 issues after Fabian left the series, Larry Hama signed on. And just how well does Larry Hama's Avengers hold up against the rest of the series? Find out next time on Grading the Avengers.